Everyone knows the great locomotives of history stayed close to home. Big Boy ruled the American West. Flying Scotsmen owned the East Coast main line. Mallards sprinted through England. The truth is, steam locomotives were prisoners of their gauge, their fuel, their infrastructure. Building a railroad meant choosing dimensions that would lock every engine to that network for life. Standard gauge, broad gauge, narrow gauge. Each was a cage of steel. But in the archives of locomotive builders, tucked between contracts for mining engines and plantation haulers, there's a design so adaptable, so brilliantly simple, that copies of it steamed across 5 continents. Not as curiosities, not as experiments, as workhorses that hauled timber in Tasmania, sugarcane in South Africa, military supplies in France, ore in South America, and construction materials across British India. The locomotive was a Hunslet 040 saddle tank, and its secret wasn't power, it was portability. Hunslet Engine Company in Leeds, England, didn't invent the industrial locomotive, but in the 1870s, they perfected something more valuable, the completely self-contained steam engine. No tender trailing behind, no dependency on turntables, no need for elaborate servicing facilities. The boiler sat over the wheels. The water tank draped across the boiler like a saddle. Coal bunker at the rear. The entire machine was 16 feet long and weighed 12 tons. You could ship it anywhere, drop it on almost any track, and it would run. The genius was in what it didn't need. Most locomotives were evolutionary dead ends, exquisitely adapted to one environment. The Hunslet was the opposite. It was deliberately primitive. 2 cylinders, 4 coupled wheels. Boiler pressure rarely exceeded 160 pounds per square inch. Tractive effort topped out around 8,000 pounds. By the standards of mainline engines, it was weak, slow, agricultural. But weak and slow didn't matter when you were building a railroad that didn't exist yet. Between 1870 and 1950, Hunslet built over 3,000 of these machines. The design spread like a virus. Other British manufacturers, Bagnall, Peckett, Andrew Barclay, copied the pattern. So did builders in Germany, Belgium, and the United States. The fundamental architecture remained unchanged. Saddle tank, inside cylinders, rigid wheelbase short enough to navigate the tightest industrial curves, and crucially, narrow enough to run on 2-foot gauge track. Narrow gauge was the key to global reach. Your standard gauge, 4 feet, 8.5 inches, was Britain's gift to the railroad world, and its curse. Once you laid standard gauge, you were committed. But narrow gauge was flexible, cheap, temporary. Colonial engineers used it to penetrate jungles. Mining companies used it to follow ore veins up mountainsides. Military quartermasters used it to supply trenches. And everywhere narrow gauge went, the Hunslet saddle tank followed. Tasmania got its first Hunslet in 1898. The locomotive worked the Northeast Dundas Tramway, hauling timber through rainforests so dense that sunlight barely reached the rails. The track was 2 feet gauge, laid on wooden sleepers that rotted and were replaced, season after season. The Hunslet didn't care. Its low center of gravity kept it stable on curves that would have derailed a tender engine. Its short wheelbase let it navigate switchbacks cut into slopes where larger locomotives would have toppled. Crews loved it because you could see both ends from the cab. When a tree fell across the track, and trees fell constantly, you knew immediately. South Africa received hundreds. The sugar estates of Natal ran entire fleets. 2-foot gauge lines snaked through cane fields, connecting plantation to mill. The locomotives worked 15-hour days during harvest season, their fireboxes glowing red in pre-dawn darkness, their exhausts punching white steam into tropical humidity. The cane had to reach the mill within 24 hours of cutting, or it would start to ferment. Speed didn't matter. Reliability did. And the Hunslets delivered. And they broke down, certainly. But when they broke, you could fix them with a hammer and a wrench. No specialized parts, no factory technicians required. France saw them during the First World War. The Western Front devoured locomotives. Artillery shattered them. Mud swallowed them. The British Army's trench railways needed engines that could be replaced quickly, moved easily, and operated by men who'd never fired a boiler before the war. Hunslet shipped hundreds to French ports. The locomotives ran on 60-centimeter gauge track, just under 2 feet, threading through communication trenches, hauling ammunition forward, bringing wounded back. German shells cratered the lines nightly. Engineer companies would relay track by morning, and the Hunslets would resume their shuttles. If one was destroyed, another took its place. Now, the design was so simple that battlefield workshops could fabricate spare parts from scrap. South America took them into the Andes, Chilean nitrate mines, Bolivian tin operations, Argentine sugar refineries. The locomotives climbed grades that would have humiliated a rack railway. On the nitrate fields of the Atacama Desert, they hauled ore in air so dry that leather cracked and wood split. Boiler water evaporated faster than it could be replaced. Crews learned to work the injectors constantly, feeding the boiler, watching the gauge glass, listening for the sound of water turning to steam in tubes that would melt if they ran dry. The locomotives survived because they were overbuilt. The boiler plates were thick. The valve gear was basic. There was nothing delicate to fail. British India deployed them everywhere. Tea plantations in Assam, or jute mills in Bengal. Construction sites for the great irrigation projects. The Public Works Department ordered them by the dozen. They appeared in Shimla, hauling building materials for the summer capital. They worked the Darjeeling Himalayan Railway's construction camps. They supplied hill stations where the Raj escaped the plains' heat. The Indian climate should have killed them. Monsoon rains, desert heat, freezing winters in the north. But the Hunslets endured. The secret was simplicity. A locomotive with fewer parts had fewer ways to fail. What made this global spread possible wasn't just the design. It was the business model. Hunslet didn't require massive orders. You could buy one locomotive. Just one. The company would build it to your specifications. Different gauge, different boiler pressure, different fuel, and ship it anywhere. And the engine arrived as a kit. Boiler, frames, wheels, motion, all carefully packed. A competent mechanic could assemble it in a week. This was revolutionary. Building a railroad no longer required negotiating with governments or floating enormous bonds. You bought the locomotive. You laid the track. You started moving freight. The standardization was invisible. Every Hunslet looked slightly different because every customer specified different details. But beneath the variations, the core design remained identical. Cylinders bolted to the frames in the same position. Valve gear assembled the same way. Boiler tubes pitched at the same angle. This meant that a fitter who learned to maintain a Hunslet in Wales could walk into a sugar plantation in Natal or a mine in Chile and understand the engine immediately. The locomotive was a universal language. By the 1920s, the design had become so ubiquitous that it was nearly invisible. Industrial railways around the world ran some variant of the saddle tank, and most traced their lineage back to Leeds. But this was the era when mainline locomotives were becoming celebrities. The streamliners, the record breakers, the giants. A 12-ton industrial engine hauling cane or timber or ore didn't make headlines. It simply worked. The Second World War gave the design one final surge. The British War Department ordered hundreds for military railways. The US Army built its own versions. They went to Burma, New Guinea, North Africa, Italy, anywhere troops needed to move supplies over temporary track. The locomotives were shipped in pieces, assembled near the front, and worked until they wore out or were destroyed. Then they were replaced. After the war, many were sold to civilian operators. A locomotive built for the Italian campaign might end up hauling coal in a Welsh colliery. The machine didn't care about its history. The irony is that the Hunslet's greatest achievement, its adaptability, is the reason it's been forgotten. There's no preserved example that represents the definitive version because there is no definitive version. Every engine was customized. Museums that collect industrial locomotives tend to focus on machines with clear provenance. A locomotive that worked in 5 different countries, on 3 different gauges, burning 4 different fuels, doesn't fit the narrative of preservation. It's too complicated, too messy, and yet the influence persists. Modern narrow-gauge tourist railways around the world run locomotives that descend directly from the Hunslet pattern. The Welsh Pool and Llanfair in Wales, the Puffing Billy Railway in Australia, the Vale of Rheidol in Britain. Walk their sheds, and you'll see the saddle tank design, refined and modernized, but fundamentally unchanged. The proportions are the same. The logic is the same. The Hunslet 040 saddle tank never set a speed record. It never hauled the Orient Express or pulled a royal train. It did something more difficult. It worked everywhere, in climates that ranged from Arctic to equatorial, on grades from sea level to 14,000 feet, burning coal, wood, or oil, hauling passengers, freight, or ammunition. It was the first truly global locomotive, and it achieved that status not through power or prestige, but through radical simplicity. Perhaps that's the deepest lesson. The machines we remember aren't always the ones that mattered most. We remember the spectacular, the record-breaking, the beautiful. But history moves on the backs of workhorses. The Hunslet steamed across 5 continents, not because it was exceptional. It was exceptional because it worked. And when you need to build a railroad in a jungle, a desert, or a war zone, working is the only thing that matters.